Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Wilcox. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first noon lecture of the semester. So we wish to welcome you to the first presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for the fall term 2015. We'll start with just a couple of announcements. So the next presentation in this series will be given by Hongwei Xu, who is a research assistant professor in the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And Professor Xu will be speaking on Is Lying Contagious? Spatial Diffusion of Agricultural Satellites During China's Great Leap Forward. This evening, at the Michigan Theater, the Electric Shadows Chinese film series will present The Golden Era, a recent film by director An Hui on the life of Chinese writer Xiao Hong. The film will be shown at 7 p.m. and is free and open to the public. The series is co-sponsored by this center and the Confucius Institute at the University of Michigan. We would appreciate if you could all please turn your cell phones off before the talk begins. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Professor Wendy Larson. She is Vice Provost for Portland Programs and Professor in East Asian Languages and Literatures at the University of Portland. Her research monographs include From AQ to Lei Feng, Freud and Revolutionary Spirit in 20th Century China, published by Stanford University Press in 2010, Women in Writing in Modern China, published by Stanford in 1998, and Literary Authority and the Chinese Writer, Ambivalence and Autobiography, published by Duke University Press in 1991. She is working on a book tentatively titled Zhang Yimou and Globalization and the Subject of Culture, as well as a project on comparative optimism under socialism and capitalism. Today, she will be speaking on Zhang Yimou, Globalization and the Subject of Culture. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, Emily. I appreciate that. I know several people here, and many of you know I've been working on Zhang Yimou for a number of years. Hopefully that number of years is now down to several months, and this book will be finished very soon. I've been interested in Zhang Yimou, and here's a picture of him born in 1951, for quite a number of years, but I got especially interested in him when I saw the film Hero, which was a very controversial film that was widely criticized and attacked both in China and the United States, Europe, and other places as well. Now, if I just go back for a little bit, I can very easily remember one of the Association for Asian Studies meetings in Seattle in the mid-'80s, and the film Yellow Earth, Huang Tu-Di, was shown, and many of us tromped over to see it. And I was so completely shocked by that film because it was something different, very different. And Chen Kai-ge, of course, was a classmate of Zhang Yimou at the Beijing Film Academy. That it was very different than the film that I had seen in the past. However, you know, even though the fourth generation, that is the generation of directors right before Zhang Yimou and Chen Kai-ge, had not made much of a splash here in the United States, suddenly it came to our attention that there was a new breed, a new kind of film director in China. Now in China, however, the film that actually surprised everyone was this one. It's called 1 in 8, Yiga Hebaga. This is by a different director, Zhang Junzhao, and it came out in 1983, and this really jolted audiences in China into realizing that something has changed. We can take a look at this comment by Guo Baocheng, who I won't read it, but what he says is basically the visual expression of this film was so surprising to him, and it was so imaginative that he calls it an entirely new filmic language. Now, these are, of course, the directors who came to represent the fifth generation of directors in China. Zhang Yimou was, in fact, the cinematographer for 1 in 8, and that was when he started to develop his unique visual style. And it became a visual style through which the new kind of film directors of the PRC were recognized in the West. Another scholar, Ni Zhen, who is a scholar of Chinese film, he notes that Zhang Yi's role as cinematographer is really what determined this specific visual style and became what he calls a legendary sort of new style in China. Now, here are the films that Zhang Yimou has directed up to this point, starting with Red Sorghum in 1987. Of course, he did his cinematography earlier with other films, and then going all the way to Coming Home in 2014, the only one I have not seen. I wish he would stop making films, because the more he makes, the more I need to see, the more I need to write, etc. But in any case, what I'm going to do today is first just give you a very general introduction of the debate around Zhang Yimou's films. What are the issues? I'm going to introduce to you my argument, what I'm trying to do, because my book is not a comprehensive book about Zhang Yimou, but it's a book that selects certain films and has a certain approach towards talking about those films. And then I'm going to talk about, do a kind of brief mini analysis of one film called Keep Cool, 有话好好说 in Chinese. I don't know if anyone has seen this film. Has anybody seen it? Yay! One person. It's very hard to get hold of this film. I've actually only seen it myself on YouTube. You can watch the entire film on YouTube, no subtitles in Chinese or in English. Some of them have subtitles in English, but those are the ones where the people in the audience have been using a camera to record it and then put it on YouTube. So, you know, Red Sorghum came out in 1987. Let's ignore codename Cougar for today. Go on to Judo and Raise the Red Lantern. This is called the Red Trilogy, and Zhang Yimou became known for the style that he developed in these three films, which was a powerful allegorical setting set in a somewhat indeterminate past that distanced the thematic and aesthetic discourses of the socialist period. So it tried to move away from the way that film had been made during the socialist period. But after Red Sorghum won the Golden Bear Award in Berlin in 1988, a very fierce debate launched about the way that Zhang Yimou was making his films and the films themselves. There were some who praised these films as having a positive ethnic spirit and a historical connection to earlier generations of Chinese, a more general Eastern aesthetic. But at the same time, the criticisms were very, very sharp. And so I'm going to sum this up very quickly for you. One of the main criticisms by feminist critics such as Dai Jianhua in China is that what Zhang Yimou does is to produce in all of his films and in all of these three played by the same actress, Gong Li, a beautiful, vulnerable, and trapped female who captures the desire of Westerners who, according to Dai Jinhua and others, subconsciously want to keep this Eastern other in a position of subservience and weakness. So what she says is that basically not only are the films sexist because they're constantly placing women in these vulnerable positions of great beauty and allure, but also they have a kind of international or global racism hidden within them. And so that was her criticism. Along these same lines, Chen Xiaoming and Zhang Yimou also criticized Zhang Yimou. And what they said is that the way that he dwells on ethnic China, in other words, all of these little ethnic particularities, is what really garners Westerners' attention, and that this is kind of a mistake because it doesn't actually deal with real contemporary Chinese life in the period that he's living. So this is what they call a process of a cultural logic of reductionism, and they believe that it continued with his later films under globalization and commercialization. Now, a related angle by Wang Yichuan and Shalin is to argue that Zhang Yimou can really be excused for kind of toting favor with the West, because that, after all, is where you enter the global film hierarchy. But nonetheless, he he is criticized for showing strange environments and mythical situations. So he focuses on these weird things that in some cases, if you look down below at the shot from Raise the Red Lanterns, people argued quite ferociously, saying these things don't even exist in China. Why are you showing them? Now, there's many Zhang Yimou critics as well, but I won't go into their criticisms, but they do basically reject all of these postmodern and post-colonial arguments, and in fact accuse people like Zhang Yimou and Dai Xinhua of trying to keep Chinese film cloistered and exceptional and not part of global discourse. So the second criticism that they make of the critics is that what's really lurking underneath these criticisms is a very old-style conservatism that wants China to be separate from the West. Now, many people in the U.S. have also written about Zhang Yimou's films. I'm not going to go through all of them. The most exceptional probably is Ray Chow, who is very pro-Zhang Yimou, and what she does is kind of turn these criticisms on their head and say that actually his filmic style and his emphasis on visuality and surface are a full-fledged confrontation with Western theories of depths. So she believes that he's not presenting a kind of Orientalism, but in fact it is a critique of Orientalism. So many of these criticisms have to do with the earlier part of Zhang's career, but with the advent of Hero in 2002, the debate started up rapidly again, and charges of fascist aesthetics, support for the authoritarian regime, and cynical commercialism were added to these earlier criticisms. Now, at the core of the debate in publications in Chinese and to a lesser degree in English is the question of how to interpret the success of Zhang's films in the West. So the problem is, what does this actually mean? And I would say that these critics' concern that Zhang has not put forward the best of Chinese culture, and their anger that he has put the nation and himself into a subservient position, and their general wariness about performative enunciations of China, in other words, representations of China in the West, points to a strong sense of inequity in the field of cultural discourse. Now I'm going to move on to my argument. That sums up basically the sort of field of debate about Zhang Yimou. I cannot tell you how many times I have told people in China that I'm working on Zhang Yimou and their face will fall. It's like, no, why are you doing that? Why would you do that? So I have a big job ahead of me if I'm going to convince people that Zhang Yimou's films are worth taking seriously from an academic perspective. Writing on Chinese cinema and the nation, Chris Berry and Mary Ann Farker, in a recent book, call for the final abandonment of the old national cinemas model. They instead argue that there should be a problematic around the question of cinema and the nation, but that films should not be taken as representing the nation. What is needed, they state, is a more complex view of agency, a concept much debated within cultural studies, where Antonio Gramsci's attempt to figure out how people could be manipulated by a state in pursuit of hegemony has spawned hundreds of studies. The solution that they propose is to argue that resistance under transnational conditions needs to be understood not as rejection, but through ambivalent metaphors of exchange ranging from theft, poaching, and appropriation to paying a price. Although they recognize that under these conditions, privacy is often considered simple resistance, they're not completely happy with the equation, eventually describing piracy with the phrase resistance as negotiation. Berry and Farquhar struggle to theorize the contradictions that make the much-debated concept of agency so slippery. One example comes in their discussion of Hero, a blockbuster that captured the international audience and was financially successful, thereby negotiating agency, albeit the new agency that is more difficult to recognize and understand. What the new agency becomes under transnational conditions is the achievement, in their words, the achievement of agency through appropriation and submission, which involves partial acceptance of American or European models or approaches, video piracy, global blockbusters, all of which contribute to the murky, half-subservient, half-resistant state of cultural indeterminacy. Now, their desire to locate agency in Chinese film speaks to our collective belief that people can creatively determine their own destinies in the face of threats, possibly through building their own unique local culture, which becomes global in other ways. And this culture then can make a stand against powerful forces that are part of the global transformation under capitalism. And yet, by contrast, Arif Derlich argues that it's impossible to imagine that local culture, even if we can come to a consensus about its qualities, can or should be preserved as a haven from changes resulting from Eurocentrism. Derlich argues that Eurocentrism has come under attack at the moment of its global victory. This history, he insists, cannot be written or spoken away by cultural theorists, who vainly hope that culture is autonomous enough that it can somehow stand against this pervasive transformation. Derlich argues that it is power, which has little to do with culture, that then dynamizes the claims of culture. In particular, it is the power of capitalism and its innovations in the social, political, and cultural realms that makes Eurocentrism more than just another ethnocentrism, according to Derlich. Chantal Mouffe's work on the political as opposed to politics and its role within globalization indirectly suggests some ways to bring clarity to the concept of the culture and its contrast with the cultural and its contrast with culture. Mouffe's perspective on the political emphasizes the antagonism inherent into human societies and necessary for their constitution. Social order, Mouffe states, emerges through the debates and struggles of people representing conflicting positions, which cannot be mediated through consensus. Thus, she identifies the salient core of the political to be the continual struggle to push forward an agenda against others. So it's not politics as in Congress or legislature, it's politics in this more abstract philosophical sense. Now, I find these reflections about agency, power, and culture useful in thinking through the cultural in Zhang Yimou's films, although they cannot be directly applied. After all, shouldn't I also be investigating the cultural, 文化 or 文化界, or the concept of civilization, 文明, in traditional and modern China? Or should I? Such a query may lead me into a conceptual bind, finding traces, or more than traces, of so-called authentic Chinese culture within the conglomeration of modern life. Is that really the right way to think not about cultural difference, but rather about the field of the cultural? Is, as Derlich implies, the influence of European categories and ideas of modernity so pervasive that they are now models to which societies across the globe more or less aspire? This assumption is often implicitly accepted in literary and film studies, where Euro-American theorists appear to hold the keys to global cultural analysis. Although in this project I started out with the phrase, the way we live, a very general phrase, to describe what the cultural is, I've modified it to our deep sense of the way we live and thrive. This definition is not new, but it engages with an abstract concept of the cultural that is not limited by specific patterns, habits, or forms. Using chopsticks, eating Chinese food, doing all of this kind of stuff. American football, although they may feed into it. The term sense recognizes the non-intellectual, non-conceptual, subjective aspects of cultural life, while deep, although possibly problematic, points to relatively tenacious perceptions, habits, and ideas. Our and we refer to the logic of the group, which recognizes the way in which the cultural is often thought to apply to communities. Thrive is a positive concept that speaks to duration and future, alluding to concerns about cultural loss that groups and individuals often express. Overall, this phrase validates any and all subcommunities, all the way down to the individual, invoking family and other group norms. The way we live and thrive does not exclude the influence of the political, social, economic, material, and so on, but it also does not privilege these realms. In Zhang's films, the cultural generally means something abstract, which is what makes the cultural, as opposed to culture, the film's most important aspect. While the first film directed by Zhang Yimou, Red Sorghum, displays confidence in the cultural as a realm of experience embodied with strength, the films that follow quickly retreat from this exuberant vision. Red Sorghum locates in the people the means to carve out a vital and powerful route into the future, even under the limitations of debilitating traditional customs and brutal invasion by a foreign power. Now I will turn to one of Zhang's rarely discussed films, Keep Cool, 有话好好说, 1996, about contemporary urban life in the margins, and proceed with a brief close reading that I hope will illustrate my argument. My argument basically is that I believe that a significant subset of Zhang's films deal with the cultural, try to figure out how the cultural works under the contemporary conditions of life in China. Keep Cool, Zhang's first effort after Qiuju Goes to Court, another great film if you haven't seen it, was virtually unknown outside of China and barely made it in the domestic market. Based on a novella by Xu Ping, the jerky handheld camera and tilted perspective mark a radical break with Zhang's past style. The plot, completely set within the urban environment, consists of two main parts, the first of which features a beautiful young woman named An Hong, that's her, and a stuttering but handsome bookseller, Zhao Xiaoshuai, that's him, played by the director Jiang Wen. Xiaoshuai is trying to establish his on-again, off-again relationship with An Hong, who has taken up with the thuggish manager of an entertainment club, Liu Delong, that's him on the bottom. Liu and his men locate Xiaoshuai, lure him toward their car, and beat him in broad daylight in front of many people. Xiaoshuai grabs the bag of a bystander and throws it at the thugs, destroying the new laptop inside. That's the bystander on the right, talking about Mencius. In the second part of the film, An Hong completely disappears, and the relationship between laptop owner Qiu Sheng, that's the Mencius guy, and Xiaoshuai replaces the romance as the film's main focus. Unlike the Red Trilogy and later films such as Qiuju Goes to Court and To Live, Keep Cool rejects history as the basis of cultural authority. The film's intensely close, jiggling camera transforms the temporal and the spatial perspective of the director's earlier films, as it rejects the open, invadable land of Red Sorghum, the contained village and dye mill of Judo, and the claustrophobic structures and distant gaze of Raise High the Red Lanterns. The film develops typical urban characters, the coquette, the worker, the manager, the intellectual, and brings them into contact, allowing the resulting interactions and their immediate context to take up the entire screen space, which highlights the human relationships with a sharp and skewed visual focus. There are two primary forms of struggle in Keep Cool. The first is the overt search for love and companionship by Xiaoshuai. Xiaoshuai up in the left. The second is the covert struggle to find a way of life that is not completely engulfed by the values of capitalism. As I discuss Keep Cool, I will draw comparisons with a film by sixth-generation director Jia Zhangke called The World. It came out in 2004. Like Keep Cool, The World features the urban poor, in this case migrant workers, who come to the capital city to look for work and find jobs in a theme park called The World. So this is the migrant workers performing on stage in The World, where there's an Eiffel Tower and there's all kinds of other monuments from the world. Although not a theme in all or even most of Jia Zhangke's work, The World expresses a deep interest in the performance of culture, something that concerns Zhang Yimou in many of his films. Whereas The World is interested in the actual conditions of the migrant workers' lives and their imaginary of cultural mobility, that's what you see on the top there, Keep Cool explores the possibilities of local, non-elite daily life, looking for clues that it can authenticate a contemporary cultural foundation. Keep Cool begins with the sound of a car engine turned over a few times before it finally catches. A young woman on a bike, followed by a man, vanishes into a set of apartments where he loses track of her. He sits in the center of the complex and sees a peddler drive by with his cart. The image of a young modern woman held in place by a rope across her bare skin and moved around as a commodity, holding together used consumer items. So this picture is on a board which is used as a way of holding in the things in the cart. With skyscrapers askew in the background is uncannily apt for the next scenes where the first performance begins. In order to find out in which just apartment the young woman lives, Xiao Shuai hires the peddler, who happens to be director Zhang Yimou, asking him to repeatedly yell out the woman's name so she will make an appearance at the window. "I'm embarrassed," the peddler protests. This is Zhang Yimou protesting. But as soon as he sees an additional 5 yuan, he screams out the phrase. The demand for emotional performance for financial gain provokes resistance, even though in this case the performer succumbs quickly. You can draw whatever you want from the fact that Zhang Yimou is playing this role. The close-ups force us. This film is really a very closely filmed. The camera does a lot of close-up work. These close-ups force us to sit in an uncomfortable proximity to people, and especially the two lovers. The story is about them, it seems, and the possibility that they will come together as a couple. Yet as they finally meet in An Hong's apartment, the bullhorn recommences. It turns out that after Xiao Shuai arranged for the first migrant worker to come back and plead the case on his behalf, going so far as to write out a script for him, this worker turned his labor over to another worker, paying him only a third of what Xiao Shuai had originally given him. In an interesting twist, this new laborer has never met Xiao Shuai and rejects his insistence that it is he who wrote the script. Rebuffing Xiao Shuai's claim as boss to determining the meaning of his labor, which he has appropriated and now owns, the worker insists on completing his tasks. Xiao Shuai tries to pay him off, but the worker retorts, "This isn't just for money." "What then?" Xiao Shuai demands to know. "To save someone's life," he says, pointing up towards An Hong's apartment. Apparently, the original laborer invested the job with a significance that transcended mere monetary compensation. The over-the-top characterization pushes the story into a low-key absurdity that barely avoids spinning out of control. The perpetually tilted camera drives home the idea that things are deeply askew. Hiring out the performance of emotions turns out to be dangerous business, with meaning and significance increasingly corrupted as one performer is replaced by the next, moving farther and farther away from the origin. And yet, this scene is the first instance in the film of a logic that runs through both Keep Cool and another of Zhang's films called Happy Times. The claims of an individual inserted into a commodified scheme who transforms the transaction by reinterpreting it, proclaiming it, or acting on it as a transcendent narrative of human emotions and non-monetary relations. Xiao Shuai eventually gives up pursuing An Hong and is confronted and beaten by An Hong's other boyfriend. When he wakes up in the hospital, he's met with a slight man with large glasses who proclaims that the injuries are minor and it is time to settle our affairs. He turns out to be the innocent bystander whose bag containing a new laptop was grabbed by Xiao Shuai to throw at the thugs. Unsurprisingly, the man has an economic claim. His computer was destroyed in the struggle and he wants remuneration. This random and spontaneous interaction supplants Xiao Shuai's pursuit of An Hong as the main story, pushing the main female character out of the narrative and replacing her with exchanges between the three men, Xiao Shuai, Qiu Sheng, and Liu Delong. Within the small, jerky spaces of Keep Cool, and despite vanishing after the first third of the film, An Hong is an important character. Whereas in The World, the character Xiao Tao, who you see on the top, is an anti-coquette who refuses to trade her ideals or the extension of a moral and committed historical existence into the future for a dubious jump ahead in the present. In other words, her boss wants her to become his mistress, and she says no. An Hong of Keep Cool is the perfect coquette. She captures the breaking of traditional relationships enhanced by the city's fractured spaces and rapid tempo, translating it into self-representation that cannot be fixed. Dangling consent before her lovers but never really committing, An Hong extends the notion of play, artificiality, and performance into the future indefinitely. An Hong's game-like relationship with Xiao Shuai sets the playfulness and irony of the entire film. Necessary to bring the males together, the coquette can be abandoned after she plays her important role, with her erasure from the screen paralleling the death of other women in Zhang Yimou's earlier films. The lasting relationship, we learn, is not between An Hong and Xiao Shuai, but between Xiao Shuai and Qiu Sheng. This new friendship surges into the future, replacing the old and cementing the all-important role of males in cultural transmission. The coquette The prostitute, the flaneur, the dandy, and the thug are all male and female stereotypes for the damaged or otherwise mutated city dweller. Yet although Anhong and Xiao Shuai both exist within the margins of the city with minimal professional or economic resources, Xiao Shuai's stubborn and earnest mission, despite its self-destructive aspect, is the opposite of the casualness that seems to drive Anhong's behavior. As Gillian Brown shows in her analysis of Hannah Webster Foster's novel, The Coquette, which came out in 1797, what makes a coquette coquetry a dubious tactic for women's self-determination is the disparity that it enacts between a woman and her words, or between her different self-representations. Brown notes that Foster portrays Eliza in the novel as never quite saying yes or no, which defines the essence of the coquette. Another model of artifice through which to evaluate the significance of Anhong's filmic role is the Dan, or the female impersonator of Beijing opera. In interpreting Anhong's behavior and her resulting eviction from the narrative, what makes the male Dan particularly illuminating is not only its historical position within Chinese theater, but also its emphasis on artistry and artificiality in female self-representation. Eventually, the Dan were replaced with female performers who surprised people with their ability to master these roles as well as the male performers. The reason for this surprise is related to the way in which female impersonators were understood to grasp and project femaleness. Male Dan and their admirers did not understand their performances as realistic, but as idealizations of female essence that were beyond the reach of biological females, who would rely too much on their natural tendencies, they argued. Kind of reminds me of Tootsie. Although the mimic culture of the world performed by costumed women on the stage seems to contain similar elements of the coquette's inauthenticity, deceit, and coyness, Jia Zhangke's central female character, Xiao Tao, is not at all like Anhong. As the anti-coquette, Xiao Tao withholds consent only to make sure that the future will unfold correctly, not for the purpose of teasing. By contrast, for Anhong, perpetual deferment allows her to float between options and avoid a fixed position within the city and within her relationships. The exclusion of the coquette, i.e. the playful but ultimately damaging embodiment of the skewed city life under capitalism, becomes the condition upon which positive culture can emerge. Okay. The next scene is actually a restaurant scene in which Qiu Sheng and Xiao Shuai are both at the restaurant, and Xiao Shuai has decided that he's going to cut off Liu Delong, the thuggish manager's guy's hand. And so they arrive at the restaurant, and Qiu Sheng doesn't know that. He thinks that he's arranged on the side for Liu Delong to give them 50,000 yuan to resolve the issue of the laptop. And so they go there and they start to have a discussion about a singer, and they start to talk about her qualities. And because she's a beautiful young woman, Xiao Shuai, who has a kind of street ideal of feminine beauty, gives her, he says, Qiu Sheng, give her a number. And Qiu Sheng doesn't know what he's talking about. And he says, give her a number, and what is the number? How would you rank her? And Qiu Sheng finally says 60%. And then and Xiao Shuai looks at her and says, at least 90%. And then they start to argue about this. And what happens is that Xiao Shuai uses the phrase, virtue in a woman is to be without talent. 女子无才便是德, which is a classical phrase about women. At this point, however, Qiu Sheng wags his finger in Xiao Shuai's face and explains the qualities of virtue, not appearance but knowledge and culture. Quoting Mengzi, as you saw in the earlier phrase, he separates exterior and interior and defines proper social behavior. Now, although the restaurant is almost empty, a large group of middle-aged women dressed in pink satin costumes pour in. Behind the earnest, horrifying argument about whether or not Xiao Shuai should cut off Liu's hand, because eventually Qiu Sheng figures it out, the camera turns to the heavily made up and ornately costumed women. I don't have time to analyze these scenes in detail, but Qiuju's attempts to restrain Xiao Shuai eventually drive him crazy, and he takes out after the younger man with a knife. They reverse roles, in other words, and that's him at the end, where he's now threatening to cut off his friend Xiao Shuai's hand instead of having Xiao Shuai cut off Liu Delong's hand. The ever-tilted camera, the red light, and the above all Camus X0 superior sign in the background, which you can see in two of these shots, enhances the ludicrousness of the scenes. Amidst the chaos and cacophony, what emerges after An Hong's disappearance is a slowly woven tapestry of spontaneous, short-lived, but sincere encounters between a number of people who enter the screen, interact, and then leave, replaced by others. The social field becomes a knotty fabric where anonymity leads to chance meetings, which leads to interactions laced with genuine feeling. The implication is that any person can comfort another, which is what happens repeatedly as Xiao Shuai tries to explain to all of these onlookers that his uncle is mentally ill, which is of course not the situation at all. Leads not to alienation, but rather to tenderness. The exchanges project a part socialist, part small town, part communitarian sensibility that ranges from honest concern to busybody nosiness. Ultimately, the two unlikely friends develop a mutual understanding and affection for each other. However, as their relationship goes on, the film brings in an increasingly incongruous set of background scenes, each of which takes its own significance and develops its own narrative value. I've just put some of these up here, and you can see that's really what it looks like when you're watching it. You can't get anything clear at all. Singing women, the older sister, the cook's threats, what seem to be tangents that end up intertwined with the men's story. The randomness, the coincidental nature of city encounters, seemingly spun out of air, becomes the new gauze of community. In this way, the removal of An Hong sparks a metamorphosis that recognizes a strong and viable life force in the daily interactions of commoners. Ultimately, the absurd scenes and black humor of the film enhance the idea that city life, with its fractured anonymity and deconstructed structures of kinship and community, can engender a unique positive logic. For Zhang Yimou, the first time, I believe, since Red Sorghum. As opposed to the world, urban dynamism exists even for commoners, and people are able to communicate across class and cultural borders. And yet, both films, through the central female characters, suggest that a positive future, that is, the present as a rich ability to creatively grasp a temporal imaginary that is enticing and fulfilling, is unattainable. The world establishes the global city as a subjective state in which cultural performance cannot be anything other than a show for profit or unreal fantasy of seamless access to the delights of the world. The Beijing of the world is visible and apparent only as an imaginative monumental icon and a real system of oppression, a grim cityscape in which women and men alike are trapped in a historical bubble that pushes them forward, despite good faith, as tools for profit and for the self-centered pleasure of others. By contrast, Keep Cool turns the chaos of the city into a principle that can, if favored by good luck, produce something optimistic, as long as the coquette is excluded. The film's typical characters, the coquette, the worker, the intellectual, and the manager, along with the exceptional and absurd narrative tangents that become briefly relevant as they unfold, imply that the generative ability of the people is creating a new culture. The film, therefore, rejects the deep history of the Red Trilogy in order to posit another way of locating authenticity in the creative ability of the people themselves. It is only the exclusion of An Hong in favor of the male friendship that alerts us to avoid where the disappeared future should reside. Thank you. Some of you may recognize this actor. Anybody? Gayo. Yes, Gayo. He plays a very hilarious policeman who lectures both of these guys as they are arrested by the police, and then he gives them the standard lecture of what you should do in the traditional logic of an old Chinese essay. You know, if this, then this, then this, then this, if this, then this, then this, then this. And so his role is really very funny. There's a lot in this film I just didn't have time to go over, but I hope I got the main idea across. If you have questions?
Did you field your own questions?
Sure, absolutely, if you have any question. Yes?
So does this theme of the cultural also apply to Zhang Yimou's historical films?
In my opinion, yes.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, so basically, it's actually a really simple idea, but it took me a long time to figure out that Zhang Yimou is not talking about Chinese culture per se. You know, he's not talking about whether or not certain aspects of Chinese culture will survive into the future under the onslaught of whatever, post-socialism, you know, the weight of the past. Each film deals with various aspects, but what he's really trying to, and I say trying to, and I don't mean to imply complete authorial intent here, but rather the films do this from my analytical perspective, and not all of them, only about half, are looking for ways in which after the basic sort of falling down of socialism and the taking on of a new project, a new national project, can a new culture emerge? Can people find a way to live that is not inauthentic, and not derivative? And so that's why I brought up the discussion by Barry and Farquhar, because they struggle to figure this out, like how, under the conditions where there's so much influence from the West and so much coming in, so many films coming in from the West, how can Chinese film sort of make a stand without falling into all kinds of strange pitfalls about Chineseness? So I think he tries to work that out. His films try to work this out on a subtle level to figure out what these new bases for creative and authentic existence could possibly be. Is that clear? So I do think he does it. I mean, I analyze, in fact, all of his earlier films in my book, and excuse me, I think that each of them takes various problematic issues, either from traditional culture or from the way that things are unfolding in the present world, and embodies those within the film and works on them as problematics, as searching for this new kind of way of being in the world. Yeah.
A lot of the controversy about Zhang seems to focus on his intentions, the suspicion about his intentions. So I'm curious if you ever thought about interviewing him, and whether Zhang himself has weighed in any interesting way. Did he ever do a director's commentary like Chicago did for one of his films?
Yeah, there's actually so many interviews with Zhang Yimou on the web, and I've read many of them, and there's some published ones as well. In terms of a real director's commentary, I don't think there's one out there the way that you're talking about. I have thought about interviewing Zhang Yimou, but I hesitate to interview Zhang Yimou for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm worried that I don't want to get a relationship with him because, and all I mean is, a friendly relationship, because I don't want to be, somebody's knocking. I don't want to be beholden to his ideas about what he's doing. And I think that will happen very subtly. Maybe there's certain things I won't say because I've talked to him, and I don't really want that to happen. Second, I think in general, writers and filmmakers, creative people, you have to approach them through their works. Now, that's not 100% true, of course. You can interview writers and whatnot, and you can look at what they say. So I do read all of the interviews with Zhang Yimou, but I want to try to first work out my own ideas about what's going on in these films, before I go to him and ask. And then if he says, no, that's not it at all, then what do I do? I don't really want to accept his interpretation. I feel like I have to put forward my interpretation. So I do hope at some future point when I'm finished that I have the opportunity to meet him.
It's really interesting that you decided to talk about this particular film in the context of today's topic, because this really, in a way, is a quite unique work in Zhang Yimou's bio. looking at. I wonder to what extent this whole old notion rather, really, of urban versus rural landscapes, the countryside versus the city, can be of relevance here. Because when we think about these earlier Zhang Yimou films, and even to the late 1990s, such as The Road Home and Not One Less, I think when he films the countryside, we get a sense of a style, a very unique way of doing colors, of doing compositions and all that. I think when you were discussing this film, you talked about the handheld camera, the almost claustrophobic space, and so on and so forth. I wonder whether there is this style of filming the big city, of life in the city, that can be talked about in the same way as we talk about Zhang Yimou's other films. This very deliberate sense of creating certain visual experience, whether we label that as Zhang Yimou or some sort of Chinese cultural sensibility or not is a different matter. But I wonder whether you could push this a bit further. And this particular film, in a way, has not been regarded as either his best film or representative. Nonetheless, seems to indicate some sort of effort to break out of the old landscape to do something different.
Yeah, actually, one reason I'm talking about this film is because I've been working on this book for a number of years, and I've talked about almost every film. And I don't like to keep doing the same thing over and over. So, the chapter I have on this, I thought I would present part of that today. But I do agree with you that there's a different style. I think if you look back, though, you can also see in Qiuju Goes to Court, you can see part of this style developing. Because when, I don't know if you remember that when she goes increasingly into larger cities, right, as she's seeking justice. And as she gets into the larger and larger cities, the camera gets jerkier and jerkier. And so he also has a handheld camera in that. But he himself said that he doesn't think that the style that he developed in this one is original or unique in any way, that it has been done in European film, it has been done in MTV, and other things like that. However, I do think that it is an attempt to move away from some of those earlier sort of rural landscape-based sort of the importance of the earth, the soil, the rural kind of stability. I do think it's an attempt to move away from that a little bit. I think you can find some aspects of this style continuing in his work after this. He doesn't use the jerky kind of crazy camera as much as he does in this one in any other film. That's certainly true. But if you look at films like Riding Alone for Thousands of Miles, you'll see a little bit more of this kind of jerky camera work going on. So yeah, I think you're right. And he has written about this or been interviewed about this film, and he regrets that this film never became known, really. It never, even in China, it's barely known. And so he regrets that somehow he thought this film was really one of his best films, and yet it didn't go anywhere. I kind of agree with him. I think it's really an excellent, a very interesting film. Had it been successful, would he have continued more with this style? That's a good question. I don't know. Mm-hmm. That's the conclusion. I mean, I don't do a real deep analysis of it, but I do conclude with that because that's a perfect example of where you can get some of these earlier critiques of, how Zhang Yimou presents himself to the world in a really actual concrete form. So I do include that at the end. Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. If you try to then, what he does there obviously is to try to grab the essences of culture, not the cultural, right? He's looking at culture, and so he takes these things, Chinese calligraphy, the compass, these things that were developed in China, and tries to enact them on the stage. Yeah, so I think it's a good comparison. I thought the performance was actually pretty good. Ai Weiwei published a critique of Zhang Yimou's opening ceremonies at the Olympics, and he applauds the British one, which came later, I think, right, 2 years after that. And I think it's totally fawning. It's totally fawning on the British, the way that he talks about it, as if they have a kind of casual way of being in the world, you know, a sort of, because remember they have the Queen coming down, remember, it's like James Bond or something, you know, a casual contemporary way of being in the world, you know, that Zhang Yimou just simply misses. So I don't like his critique, but I do talk about it, yeah.
It's more of a comment, I guess, but I wonder what happens if we put the whole West question into brackets and think about his career in terms of art cinema and popular cinema. Because when I look at the images here, what I see is not MTV or Western art cinema, but Hong Kong. And the extremity of the angles, the closeness, the distortion of the lens, the playfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what happens if you map art versus popular onto even not just his career, but fifth generation, sixth generation. Because that's what you kind of did in this as well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Jia is interesting because he, until recently, has really persisted in a popular mode.
Jia Zhangke,
Yeah.
a popular mode?
Well,
I would say he's the perfect intellectual director.
Well, until Touch of Sin, until Touch of Sin and the film he just completed, and which actually got some of the censorship. But I mean, there's something going on in his career that's like trailing Johnny Moe, maybe. But
Oh, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. I see your point, and I think it's it would be an interesting exercise to try to bracket that whole Western, you know, thing, and instead map this other kind of thing onto Zhang Yimou's film. In a way, in my project, I do kind of bracket that stuff. I mean, I discuss it in my introduction, but I bracket it at that point because a lot of it I don't agree with, you know, and so for that reason, I'm trying to look at the films from a different angle. But I think that your point that what you see in this film you've seen in Hong Kong is a very interesting one, and I'll look into that a little bit more.
I guess one question is, what's possible? So at the beginning of his career, what sort of cinema is possible?
Mhm.
Not doing a kind of official style cinema.
Mm-hmm.
I guess art film was available, but not Hong Kong style popular crudeness.
I think they were familiar with it to some degree, but not nearly as much as. I mean, this was 1996, of course, so it's a full 10 years after, you know, he started making his films. But I think they were familiar with Hong Kong film at that time, but they didn't admire it as much. I mean, the Hong Kong film has had an upsurge, right, in all of the martial arts films as well as other kinds of films. So they're much more popular now than they were then. I think that the art, when Johnny Moe started working, the European art films were considered the highest form of film art. Anybody else? Oh, it's a lot.
You mentioned Happy Times.
Mhm.
That's another excellent urban film directed by Zhang. And in that film, there's a very heavy allegorical element, you know, with the performative aspect of the story. You know, in this film, you do talk about the last person having to say is this policeman. Do you see any kind of allegorical narrative about the role of the state in contemporary Chinese culture as it develops?
So this scene it ends my presentation, but it doesn't end the film.
Oh, okay.
The film ends with these two men getting back. It's actually Qiu Sheng, the intellectual, gets out of jail, and he gets the same lecture, and he goes on, and then he gets a car is waiting for him, and there's a letter out there for him, and it's from Xiao Shuai, and then he goes to meet him. So then it stops at that point. So the implication is that a real friendship has developed out of that. The funny thing about the role of the state, you won't see a lot of it in this film, but you do see it in this policeman in Guillau's role. But it's full, it's just dripping with irony. And so there, you know, it's not quite the same sort of thing as you see in Happy Times. Although in Happy Times, I don't, you know, the role of the state is treated as a remnant It's not treated as a powerful form of, social organization. It's something that's left over. And so the question is how to deal with that leftoverness quality of the role of the state. That's a good question. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Maybe wait. You had okay. Go ahead.
This is I'm not a cultural theorist of any kind.
That's okay.
At the idea of cultural appropriation, the Western version of culture has had an appeal because it ensured greater degree of physical survival. That's been a given.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
It ensured greater physical survival. That's been appeal to anybody, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the strengths of the American version of Western culture is our sense that we want to appropriate, or at least that we do appropriate pieces from other cultures. I mean, the Republicans are all anti-immigration, but they want to have legal immigration targeted to drain brains from elsewhere. So it's an openness, a self-assuredness that while we can take the best from everywhere, we don't have to worry about messing up our culture.
Okay. So you mean that in the U.S. We're more open to these various cultural influences, or are you saying that?
It's kind of odd because when we say we're more open, we're very people to look at little bits and pieces of it. But at the same time, we're pretty sure that our culture isn't going to change much.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're talking about. I think, the U.S. is being a very new society and also being such a powerful country right now, globally. It's in a rather unique position. And you don't see similar openness to immigration anywhere. Now, we can talk about this a lot, and I'm not a specialist on it, but we certainly can talk about what the basis of that immigration were and what went before and what had to be wiped out before that immigration was possible. We can talk about those sort of things. But I don't think that the U.S. is in a defensive position in terms of cultural essence as much as most other countries in the world. And this is something that Frederick Jameson has pointed out, and he's been criticized for it, of course, is that in the U.S., the U.S. has the privilege of not having to worry so much about its cultural position, and because, as Arif Derlich says, it has power. It's a very powerful country. And so when you're a very powerful country, you don't have to worry much because you're basically out there as a model for people to follow. I'm not sure that was a right comment for your comment, but
We've had arguments over Chick-fil-A as to the cultural position of the owners on that against homosexuality. But I can't imagine in the United States trying to purify the culture of bully, the way the French went after the Arabic fast food.
oh, mm-hmm.
Or trying to chase the McDonald's out, or
Well, I think there are things like that in the U.S. I mean, maybe not exactly the same sort of thing, but there are instances where people feel very insecure about the presence of non-familiar cultures. But probably we should talk about it maybe later. Yeah.
So the variable I'd be curious about is money.
Uh-huh.
And so Keep Cool looks like it could have been done on a very low budget. So we tend to think of these alter directors as being in charge, but they will be less in charge the more they're invested people.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think that if you factor in money and who are the sponsors for the different productions, they will sort out in different kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
I understand you saying that this is a fairly free film and what he's up to. He's indulging a lot of freedom,
Mm-hmm.
which I would expect has to do and he doesn't feel indebted to sponsors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in many of Zhang's films that the large focus is not necessarily on capitalism or money or how money is changing, how the role of money is changing the lives of people, but it's almost always there.
And the more money, the more constraint.
Mm-hmm. Hard to know. But I don't know what the budget was for this film, but it probably was a lower budget film. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You've said that one of his concerns is finding a way of life that is not derivative and inauthentic, perhaps corrupted by Western values. to what extent does he consider religion to be an ingredient in that authenticity?
First of all, I probably should have clarified a little bit more, but it's not necessarily that he's looking for a life that hasn't been corrupted by Western values, but that he's looking for a life under the present situation, in which already, you know, there's many Western values and all kinds of other things working together. So under the conditions that we actually have, is it possible to build a cultural foundation that allows people to believe they're living an authentic life, or it helps people people can construct this or build it themselves. Religion, now let me think. Religion. Can anybody think of religion in Zhang Yimou's films? Is there any religion? I don't think there's any religion.
No portrayal of religion at all.
I don't think there's any religion, yeah. Let me think. I don't think so. I don't think it's part of it. Yeah?
In your definition of the cultural, there was that pronoun, that collective pronoun we.
Yes.
I'm curious who you think that refers to, if you see these films as a process of contemplating the possibilities, right, for authentic and creative lifestyles, well, for whom, and who's part of that contemplation or that
Right.
exploration?
I don't think he has any broad thing like the Chinese people in mind. You know, I think it's these smaller communities. He looks at smaller communities of people and how they're doing it under different circumstances. And so they're not all the same in the kind of problems that they have. So, you know, the we can be, and here it's really just these 4 people. And, you know, these other people come in as part of this frenetic background, but it's these 4 people. These 4 people are all kind of, you know, poor urban people, poor urban working people, except for Qiu has these intellectual tendencies, and then Liu Delong seems to have been successful as a kind of gangster entertainment, you know, manager guy. So I don't think there's a broad national vision there. Zhang Yimou often is criticized for cultural nationalism, but I don't agree with that criticism, and I will attempt in my book to show that it's wrong. Okay, maybe that's all. Well, thank you very much.